Steve Harvey had a gift for reading people. In more than a decade of hosting Family Feud, he had stood across from thousands of contestants and learned to see, in the first 30 seconds, exactly what kind of story he was dealing with. The nervous talkers, the overconfident ones who peaked in the warm-up, the quiet grandmothers who turned out to be the sharpest competitors in the room. He had seen them all. What he had not seen, or perhaps had not allowed himself to see, was what walked onto that stage on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2023, in the person of Marcus Webb. Marcus was 58 years old, built wide through the shoulders the way men get when they have spent their working lives using their hands for something real. He had close-cropped gray hair and deep lines around his eyes, the kind that came from years of squinting into the sun on job sites, and, if you looked more carefully, from years of something else entirely. He wore a navy blue dress shirt with the Webb family name stitched on the pocket in gold thread. His daughter had insisted on that detail. He had let her have it. He stood at the contestants' podium with a quietness that was different from nerves. It was the stillness of a man who had been through things that make a game show feel manageable. Beside him in the family lineup stood his adult son Devin, his daughter Keisha, his sister Brenda, and the woman at the far end, his wife Carol, 54 years old. With natural silver locks, and the kind of smile that looked like it had been installed permanently, and nothing had ever successfully removed it. Steve Harvey approached him with his usual warm swagger, already warming up the crowd. "Marcus, my man." He gave him the look, up and down, one eyebrow raised, the grin forming in the corner of his mouth that told the audience something was coming. "You married?" "Yes, sir," Marcus said. His voice was deep and unhurried. All right. Steve nodded approvingly. "And how long you been with your beautiful lady over there?" Marcus glanced at Carol. 15 years, married, been together 18. 18 years. Steve pressed his hand to his chest. "That is beautiful, brother, you're doing something right." He let the moment breathe. Then he hit him with it. "Is this your first marriage, Marcus?" The studio went still for half a second, and Marcus Webb said the words that started everything. "No, sir," he said simply. "This is my third." The audience exploded. Laughter rolled through the studio in a wave. Gasps, someone near the front actually clapped. It was exactly the kind of setup that Steve Harvey had turned into television gold 100 times before, and the audience could already see the punchline forming in his eyes. Steve opened his mouth, and then he looked at Marcus's face, and he closed it again. Marcus Darnell Webb was born in 1965 in Birmingham, Alabama. The second of 5 children raised in a house on Dunstan Avenue that had 3 bedrooms and never quite enough of anything except love and expectation. His father, Raymond, worked the floor at a steel plant for 31 years. His mother, Gloria, cleaned other people's houses during the week and sang the lead in the church choir on Sundays. They were not wealthy by any measure the world uses to keep score. But Raymond Webb believed in 2 things above all else: the value of work done right and the obligation to stand by the people you loved no matter what the cost. Marcus learned to use his hands before he learned to drive. By 12, he could build a birdhouse from raw lumber without help. By 16, he was working weekends with his uncle's carpentry business, learning to read blueprints and feel the grain of wood beneath his fingers, and understand, in a way that went deeper than technique, how to make something lasting out of raw material. He had a patience for the work that his uncle said was a gift. You couldn't teach patience, his uncle always said. Either a man had it or he didn't. After high school, Marcus enlisted in the Army. He served 6 years, including a deployment during the Gulf War in 1991. He came back quieter than he left, but whole. He came back with a trade certification, a clear sense of what mattered, and the beginnings of the small carpentry business that he would spend the next 3 decades building one job at a time. And then, in the summer of 1992, at a church cookout in Tuscaloosa, he met Denise Carter. Denise was a 3rd-grade teacher with the kind of laugh that made everyone in the room feel like they had just been let in on a private joke. She was sharp and warm and completely genuine in the way that some people manage without trying. Marcus told his mother that same night that he had met the woman he was going to marry. His mother looked at him for a long time and then nodded once and said, "Then don't you waste any time." He didn't. They married in June of 1993. He built the arch she walked under with his own 2 hands. For 12 years, Marcus and Denise built something that was not glamorous and not easy and was, in the ways that count, completely good. A house outside Birmingham. 2 children, Devon, and then Keisha. A life that held arguments about money and schedules and who forgot to pick up Devon from football practice, and never an argument about the things that actually mattered. They knew what those were. They held on to them. In 2005, Denise found a lump, stage 3 breast cancer. The doctor said it plainly, the way doctors have to. Marcus sat in that office holding Denise's hand so tightly that she finally had to tell him to ease up. She was smiling when she said it. That was who she was. She went through chemotherapy and lost her hair, and lost 30 pounds, and there were mornings when she could not get out of bed. And through all of it, she never once lost her sense of humor. She wore her bald head like a crown. She went back to her classroom as often as her body allowed. She sat in Marcus's truck on cold winter mornings while he drove her to treatments, and she would hold his hand and talk about what she was going to plant in the garden when spring came. Spring came. And another spring after that. And then, in September of 2007, after 2 years of fighting with everything she had, Denise Webb died at home, in her own bed, with Marcus beside her and their children in the next room. She was 41 years old. Marcus was 42. He had 2 children who needed him, and a business to run, and a house that suddenly felt like it had been built for a family that no longer existed. He got up every morning because that was what a man did. He drove Devon to football and Keisha to dance, and he made dinner and paid the bills and kept every light on in the house, and kept every promise he had made to his children. But the light inside him had gone out. He met Sandra 18 months later. She was a good woman. Marcus always said that clearly, because it was true. The failure of what followed was not her fault, and it was not his fault. It was the fault of grief, which is a powerful and dishonest thing that convinces a man who is drowning that he is swimming. He had married Sandra not because he was ready, but because he was lonely and she was kind, and he had made the mistake of believing that moving forward meant moving on from Denise. It did not. They lasted 22 months. They parted without hatred, and divorced without drama. Sandra rebuilt her life. Marcus wished her nothing but well and meant every word of it. It was 3 years after that when he walked into a fundraiser for a youth center in Montgomery and heard a woman near the drink table arguing, politely, firmly, with complete conviction, about the correct way to make lemonade. He found it funny. He told her so. She told him he was welcome to make his own then. Her name was Carol Johnson. He had been smiling ever since. Carol went into their relationship knowing everything. She knew about Denise. She knew about Sandra. She knew the shape of who Marcus Webb was and where all of it had come from, and she had never, not once in 18 years together, 15 of them married, made him feel that his history was something to be ashamed of. "Your past made you who you are," she told him once, not long after they had started dating, when he had sat across from her at her kitchen table and laid all of it out because he didn't know how to be anything other than honest. "And I love who you are. So what exactly do you want me to do with your past?" He had laughed. He was still laughing, 18 years later. That was the woman at the end of the Family Feud lineup, pressing her hand over her heart and watching her husband stand at the podium, while 200 people in the studio audience waited for the punchline that Steve Harvey had not yet delivered. Steve Harvey had exactly 2 seconds where he could have gone either way. He was a comedian. He had built an entire career on the precision of timing and the delivery of truth wrapped in laughter, and the truth was that Third Marriage was among the most reliable setups for a punchline he had ever encountered. The audience was primed. They were leaning forward. They were practically handing him the joke gift wrapped with a bow. But Steve Harvey had also grown up watching his parents fight through things that broke other families. He had been through marriages that failed. He knew what the number on a marriage certificate did and did not tell you about a man's character. And something in the way Marcus had said "my Carol," the way his eyes had moved through the lineup to find her before he finished the sentence, the way his voice had dropped on the word "my," had landed somewhere that comedy could not reach. He looked at Marcus Webb's face and did not see a punchline. He saw a man carrying something. "Hold on," Steve said quietly. He raised one hand toward the audience. "Hold on a second now." The laughter dissolved into murmuring, then into silence. "Marcus," Steve took a small step forward. He dropped the performance, the raised eyebrow, the showman's posture, all of it. He just stood there, man to man, in the middle of the stage. "What happened?" Marcus looked at him for a moment. He was not the kind of man who talked about his life easily. He had spent 16 years carefully managing who got to know about Denise, because talking about her meant reliving everything that came after, the months of hollow going through the motions, the mistake of marrying Sandra before the grief had cleared, the long, slow work of becoming someone who could be loved again without flinching. But something about the way Steve Harvey had asked, quietly, directly, without the setup of a joke, made Marcus decide to answer the way he always answered when he thought the truth was the only worthy thing. "My first wife passed," Marcus said. The studio went completely quiet, not the polite quiet of a crowd following a cue, the real kind. The kind that happens when a room full of strangers all feel the same thing at the same time and realize it. "Breast cancer," he continued, his voice steady but careful, the way a man's voice gets when he has walked a road so many times that he knows every stone but has never found it easy. "We were married 12 years. She was a school teacher, best mother I've ever seen. Fought for 2 years, and she never once complained." He paused, just long enough. "She passed in 2007. She was 41 years old." Steve Harvey said nothing. He stood still and he listened. Anyone who had watched this man host television for the better part of 2 decades knew that Steve Harvey almost never just listened. But he was listening now. "After she passed," Marcus said, "I wasn't right. I didn't know that at the time, but I was not right. Got remarried too soon to a good woman who deserved better than what I could offer her while I was still grieving. That didn't last. I don't blame her." He looked down at his hands for a moment, big work-scarred hands. The hands of a man who built things for a living. "I blame grief. Grief will make you reach for the nearest solid thing before you're ready to hold anything." He looked back up. "Then I met Carol. And Carol knew the whole story going in. Every single piece of it. And she stayed." Down the lineup, Carol Webb pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were full. Somewhere in the studio audience, a woman had started crying. A single quiet sound that broke the silence and made everything feel real. And then a voice, young, female, somewhere in the middle of the crowd, said something she probably didn't intend for anyone to hear. But the microphones in that studio were very good. I mean, 3 times though. It was a whisper. Dismissive, the kind of thing people say when they are young enough that they have not yet understood what life is capable of taking from a person. Steve Harvey heard it. He turned toward the audience. Slowly, what happened in the next 3 minutes would be shared more than 45 million times across social media platforms within 10 days of the episode airing. Television producers who had worked in the industry for decades would say they had never seen anything quite like it. Not because it was loud, because it was the opposite of loud. Steve Harvey turned to face the audience and his voice was completely quiet. "Let me say something," he said. "And I want everybody to actually hear me, because I mean every word of this." The studio was absolutely still. "This man right here," he said, gesturing to Marcus with a slow, deliberate motion, buried his wife. He sat beside her while cancer took her at 41 years old. He raised 2 children by himself. He made a mistake when he was broken, and he is man enough to stand here and say so in front of all of you. Steve paused. And the only thing some of y'all caught was the number 3. Nobody moved. "I'm going to tell you something I don't usually talk about on this stage," Steve continued, and his voice was not a performer's voice anymore. It was simply a man's voice, and the difference was everything. "I have been married 3 times. My first 2 marriages failed. I am not proud of every decision I made in those years. But I am standing here today because I did not decide that getting it wrong meant I was never allowed to try again. The woman I am with now, she is the great blessing of my life. And she didn't come to me because I had a clean record. She came to me because I finally understood what love actually costs. He paused. Sometimes you have to go through the wrong things to understand what right looks like. And sometimes life takes something from you that you did not deserve to lose, and grief does things to a person that nobody warns you about. And that is not weakness. That is being human in a world that doesn't always treat us gently. He turned back to Marcus. His voice went quieter still. Marcus, I was about to make a joke. I had it right there, ready to go. And I am genuinely grateful that something stopped me, because what you just shared with this room is not a punchline. It is a man's life. It is loss and love, and trying again and finally getting it right. He stopped. You have nothing, not one single thing to be ashamed of. For a moment, Marcus Webb just blinked. He had not cried publicly since Denise's funeral. He was a man who believed that grief was private and that strength meant keeping it that way. But standing in the middle of the Family Feud stage with 200 people witnessing someone look at his life honestly and speak of it with respect, something in him gave way. His jaw tightened. He nodded once. He did not look away. Steve Harvey turned to the audience. We spend so much of our time in this world counting people's numbers, he said. Their age, their income, how many times they got something wrong. But those numbers never tell you the story behind them. You hear 3 marriages and you think you know something about a man. But you don't. You don't know what it cost. You don't know what it taught him. And you don't know what it built. He let that sit. So maybe instead of counting, we ought to start asking the story. The studio erupted. Not the burst of laughter that opens a floodgate and releases. This was something longer and deeper, sustained applause that built as people got to their feet, and kept building as more stood, until the entire studio was on its feet at once. Carol Webb had broken from the family lineup and was walking toward her husband, and Marcus turned to meet her, and she took his face in both her hands and said something that the microphones did not catch. Whatever it was, he nodded, and something released in his shoulders that had been held tight since he walked onto that stage. Steve Harvey reached out and shook Marcus Webb's hand with both of his own, the way men do when a handshake means something. You are a good man, Steve said quietly. A real good man. The Webb family won their episode. They played with the kind of calm focus that belongs to people who have already faced their hardest battles and find a game show entirely manageable by comparison. Carol dominated 3 consecutive rounds with the instincts of a woman who had spent decades learning to read what people actually meant. Devon scored the highest single round total of the day. And Marcus, steady as a man who builds things for a living, never missed when it mattered. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, the clip of Steve Harvey's speech went viral before midnight of the first day. By the end of 72 hours, it had been viewed 30 million times. By the end of 10 days, 45 million. News programs picked it up. Morning shows replayed it. Grief counselors shared it with their clients. Veterans organizations posted it in their community groups with notes that said, "This." The comments were unlike anything the Family Feud social team had ever seen. Not the usual quick reactions, but long, carefully written paragraphs from people telling their own stories. Men who had lost their first wives and spent years afterward feeling judged every time someone asked how many times they had been married. Women who had left damaging marriages and rebuilt and loved again, and been looked at sideways by people who counted the number. Parent after parent writing about what they were going to show their children, and why, and what they hoped they would understand about love being something you had to keep choosing even when it was hard and even when it cost you. Steve Harvey invited Marcus and Carol onto his talk show the month after the Family Feud episode aired. They sat on the couch and told the whole story: Denise, the cancer, the grief, Sandra, the fundraiser where Carol had been arguing about lemonade, and the studio audience wept through most of it. Steve Harvey, for the second time in as many months, was moved by this man in a way he was not prepared for. "Here is what I keep thinking about," Steve said during that segment. "I keep thinking about how close I was to making a joke that would have moved us on to the next segment and we never would have heard any of this. A half a second. That's all the space there was between a laugh and a conversation that I will carry with me for the rest of my life." Marcus's daughter Keisha started writing about growing up as the child of a man who grieved and rebuilt. She had been 14 when her mother died. She remembered what it looked like, her father getting up every morning and doing what needed to be done, and never letting them see him fall apart, and the years it had taken her to understand that doing what needed to be done was itself a profound act of love. She wrote about what Carol had meant to their family, not as a replacement, never that, as an addition, as someone who had stepped into a life that already had a shape and made it larger. Her writing became a book. She called it The Third Try, and she explained in the introduction that the title was not ironic and not self-pitying. It was honest. Some things are worth trying more than once. Some things are worth trying until you get them right. The book spent nearly a year on bestseller lists. It was used in grief counseling programs. It was distributed in veterans support networks across the country. It was read by people who had lost spouses and did not know whether they were allowed to love again, and it told them, simply and clearly and without apology, that they were. Marcus Webb remained who he had always been, a carpenter from Birmingham. He still got up before 6, still drove to job sites in his truck, still burned the first batch of pancakes every time he made them for Carol on Sunday mornings, and Carol still ate them without comment because she was that kind of woman. But he began to speak in the small ways that matter. A veterans meeting here, a church group there, a conversation after a speaking event with a man who gripped his hand and couldn't say anything for a long moment because he had lost his wife 4 years earlier and had been afraid to let himself love someone new. "I watched your episode 9 times, that man finally said. Marcus held his hand. "I called her this morning." 1 year after the Family Feud episode aired, Steve Harvey invited Marcus to speak at a foundation dinner focused on family resilience. Marcus sat at a long table with Carol beside him, and Devin and Keisha, across from him and his grandchildren running between the chairs, and he looked at all of it, all the people, all the years, all the loss that had led to this abundance, and understood something about his life that had not been visible when he was living inside it. All of it had built toward this. The love and the grief and the mistake and the rebuilding and the choosing to try again. All of it had made him the man sitting at this table. He stood up when it was his turn to speak. He didn't use notes. He said, "I used to be ashamed of the number 3. I thought it was evidence of something wrong in me. Now I understand that 3 is simply how many times it took me to learn what love actually asks of a person. It asks everything. It asks you to keep going when keeping going is the hardest thing you have ever done in your life. And if you are fortunate, and I have been more fortunate than I deserve, you find someone who sees all of it and stays anyway." He looked at Carol. "That is not failure," he said. "That is how you earn something worth keeping." The room stood. Steve Harvey was the first one on his feet.